Right, good morning, class. Welcome to week one of YouTube video, movies, and learning online. I'm so excited to be with you here today, and today we are actually going to get the chance to start our very first novel study. So the novel that your group is going to be reading today is Percy Jackson's The Lightning Thief. This story is a myth. So when we think about myths, we know myths are fiction books. They're not real. They're not based on true stories or real events. And some of the characteristics that we want to look for in myths are the following. So first, myths are fictional stories, like I said, and they come from ancient Greece or Roman culture. So when you notice I'm talking about Greek or Roman culture, that can be a hint that this might be a myth. The second thing is myths may explain parts of nature. So they might explain why storms happen or earthquakes and all of those different natural disasters, or even just like seasons changing, things like that. The third thing is myths also explain the origin or the beginnings of things in our world. So they might talk about the beginning of good and evil, things like that. They also talk about characters that might be gods, goddesses, monsters, and then how they interact with humans. So keep that in mind as you're reading today. And finally, myths usually teach a moral lesson, so we can learn something from these myths. So today, one of the things I want you to be looking for is what characteristics of myths do you see in this novel? The second thing I want us to think about is our objective. So this is our objective for today. Kipsters will be able to describe the character based on their thoughts, words, and actions. Character traits. So we're looking for what character traits do the characters have. And a character trait is a word used to describe a character's personality. So again, we're going to look at their thoughts, look at their words, and we're going to look at their actions to help us figure out what word we would use to describe a character. So the first person that we're going to be looking at today is Percy Jackson. He's going to be the main character in our story, and that's who we're going to want to be looking at. So right now, if you would like to, you can pull up chapter 1. It is linked for under day 131. There's a Word document with the chapter linked there. We're only going to be reading one chapter a day because these chapters are pretty long, so it will take a good majority of the video just to read the chapter out loud. About halfway through the chapter, I'm going to stop and we're going to do an example about the objective. So today we'll be doing one example about character trait that we would use to describe Percy Jackson based off his thoughts, words, and actions. So without further ado, we are going to get started with our book. So I want you guys to pull up chapter 1. If you need to pause the video for a second while you do that, that's fine. You don't need to be watching this video while I'm reading it out loud. You just need to be listening. All right. Chapter 1. I accidentally vaporized my pre-algebra teacher. Look, I didn't want to be a half-blood. You're reading this because you think that you might be one. My advice is, close this book right now. Believe whatever lie your mom or dad told you about your birth. And try to lead a normal life. Being a half-blood is dangerous. It's scary. Most of the time, it gets you killed in painful, nasty ways. If you're a normal kid reading this book because you think it's fiction, great, read on. I envy you for being able to believe that none of this ever happened. But if you recognize yourself in these pages, if you feel something stirring inside, stop reading immediately. You might be one of us. And once you know that, it's only a matter of time before they sense it too. And they'll come for you. Don't say I didn't warn you. My name is Percy Jackson. I'm 12 years old. Until a few months ago, I was a boarding student at Yancey Academy, a private school for troubled kids in upstate New York. Am I a troubled kid? Yeah, you could say that. I could start at any point in my short, miserable life to prove it. But things really started going bad last May, when our 6th grade class took a field trip to Manhattan. 28 mental case kids and 2 teachers on a yellow school bus, heading to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to look at ancient Greek and Roman stuff. I know it sounds like torture. Most Yancey field trips were. But Mr. Bruner, our Latin teacher, was leading this trip, so I had hopes. Pause for a second. I've already seen them talk about Greek and Roman things, and that is one of the characteristics of a myth. So I'm going to keep reading, but I want you to be thinking about those things as well. All right, we're going to continue. Mr. Brunner was this middle-aged guy in a motorized wheelchair. He had thinning hair and a scruffy beard and a frayed tweed jacket, which always smelled like coffee. You wouldn't think he'd be cool, but he told stories and jokes and let us play games in class. He also had this awesome collection of Roman armor and weapons, so he was the only teacher whose class didn't put me to sleep. I hoped this trip would be okay. At least I hoped that for once I wouldn't get into trouble. Boy, was I wrong. See, bad things happen to me on field trips. Like at my 5th grade school, when we went to the Saratoga battlefield, I had this accident with a Revolutionary War cannon. I wasn't aiming for the school bus, but of course I got expelled anyway. And before that, at my 4th grade school, when we took a behind-the-scenes tour of the Marine World Shark Pool, I sort of hit the wrong lever on the catwalk, and our class took an unplanned swim. And the time before that, well, you get the picture. This trip, I was determined to be good. All the way into the city, I put up with Nancy Bobofit, the freckly, red-headed, kleptomaniac girl, hitting my best friend Grover in the back of the head with chunks of peanut butter and ketchup sandwich. Grover was an easy target. He was scrawny. He cried when he got frustrated. He must have been held back several grades because he was the only 6th grader with acne and the start of a wispy beard on his chin. On top of all that, he was crippled. He had a note excusing him from PE for the rest of his life because he had some kind of muscular disease in his legs. He walked funny, like every step hurt him. But don't let that fool you. You should have seen him run when it was enchilada day and the cafeteria. Anyway, Nancy Bobofit was throwing wads of sandwich that stuck in his curly brown hair. And she knew I couldn't do anything back to her because I was already on probation. The headmaster had threatened me with death by in-school suspension if anything bad, embarrassing, or even mildly entertaining happened on this trip. I'm going to kill her, I mumbled. Grover tried to calm me down. It's okay, I like peanut butter. He dodged another piece of Nancy's lunch. That's it. I started to get up, but Grover pulled me back to my seat. You're already on probation, he reminded me. You know who'll get blamed if anything happens. Looking back on it, I wish I'd decked Nancy Bobofit right then and there. In-school suspension would have been nothing compared to the mess I was about to get myself into. All right, pause there, because we've already learned a lot about our character, Percy Jackson. So our objective for today, and you can pull this up on the document that says Day 131, Lightning Thief Questions. Our objective for today, like I said, is describe a character using their thoughts, words, and actions. So we're going to be looking for what character trait could we use to describe Percy Jackson based on his thoughts, words, and actions. So the first thing we need to do is think about what thoughts, words, and actions did we see so far in the story. So far in the story, I've seen a lot of Percy Jackson's thoughts. In some of his thoughts, it talks about his actions as well. I've also seen his words. So one part of the story that I want to point us back to is where he's remembering some of the actions that he had on his last school field trips. So they talk about in here where it says, see, bad things happened to me on my field trips. 5th grade, he went to the Saratoga battlefield and he had an accident with the Revolutionary War cannon. And then in 4th grade, he had an accident where he pulled the wrong lever and people, their whole class, took an unplanned swim in the shark tank. And then now, on this current field trip, he and his friend Grover are getting into an altercation with Nancy Bobofit. So he wants to get up. He says, I'm going to kill her, I mumbled. Grover tried to calm me down. It's okay, I like peanut butter. He dodged another piece of Nancy's lunch. That's it. I started to get up. Grover pulled me back to my seat. So there we saw not only his thoughts, because he was telling us what he wanted to do, like I started to get up, his actions, he started to get up, he said these things, that's it, I'm going to kill her. So we've seen, based on his thoughts, his words, and his actions, the word that I would use to describe him based on those 3 instances in the story is rash or reckless. He makes decisions very quickly without the consideration of the consequences. So that was step 2. So now I'm moving on to step 3. I need to find the evidence to support my answer. So I would choose this piece. Grover tried to calm me down. It's okay, I like peanut butter. He dodged another piece of Nancy's lunch. That's it. I started to get up, but Grover pulled me back to my seat. So he's once again not thinking through the decisions that he's making and making very rash decisions. So then I would put that all together, and you can see my exemplar answer underneath step 1, 2, and 3 on the page. So I did a CER. I said Percy is rash or reckless because he makes decisions on field trips that have negative consequences. For example, he talks about an accident with a cannon and a shark pool. Now, on the field trip, he almost gets into an altercation with another student. In the text it says, Grover tried to calm me down. It's okay, I like peanut butter. He dodged another piece of Nancy Bobofit's lunch. That's it. I started to get up, but Grover pulled me back to my seat. This proves that Percy, now I'll do my R. This proves that Percy is rash or reckless because he makes decisions that sometimes lead to much larger problems or consequences. So that is how I would fill out my CER and choose the correct character trait for Percy. So as we're continuing to read, I want you to be thinking about his thoughts, words, and actions in the rest of the story and what character trait you would use to describe him. It could be a similar one, but it also could be something totally different. So I want you to be thinking about that as you are reading. So let's go back to our story. We're starting where it says Mr. Brunner. All right, let's begin. If you need to pause this while you get the page pulled up, that's fine too. Mr. Brunner led the museum tour. He rode up front in his wheelchair, guiding us through the big echoey galleries, past marble statues and glass cases full of really old black and orange pottery. It blew my mind that this stuff had survived for 2,000, 3,000 years. He gathered us around a 13-foot tall stone column with a big sphinx on the top and started telling us how it was a grave marker, a steal, for a girl about our age. He told us about the carvings on the sides. I was trying to listen to what he had to say because it was kind of interesting, but everybody around me was talking, and every time I told them to shut up, the other teacher chaperone, Mrs. Dodds, would give me the evil eye. Mrs. Dodds was this little math teacher from Georgia who always wore a black leather jacket, even though she was 50 years old. She looked mean enough to ride a Harley right into your locker. She had come to Yancey halfway through the year when our last math teacher had a nervous breakdown. From the first day, Mrs. Dodds loved Nancy Bobofit, and figured I was the devil's spawn. She would point her crooked finger at me and say, "Now, honey," real sweet, and I knew I was going to get after-school detention for a month. One time, after she'd made me erase answers out of old math workbooks until midnight, I told Grover that I didn't think Mrs. Dodds was human. He looked at me, real serious, and said, "You're absolutely right." Mr. Brunner kept talking about Greek funeral art. Finally, Nancy Bobofit snickered something about the naked guy on the steel, and I turned around and said, "Will you shut up?" It came out louder than I meant it to. The whole group laughed. Mr. Brunner stopped his story. "Mr. Jackson," he said, "did you have a comment?" My face was totally red. I said, "No, sir." Mr. Brunner pointed to one of the pictures on the steel. "Perhaps you'll tell us what this picture represents." I looked at the carvings and felt a flush of relief because I actually recognized it. "That's Kronos eating his kids, right?" "Yes," Mr. Brunner said, obviously not satisfied. "And he did this because?" "Well," I racked my brain to remember. "Kronos was the king god, and—" "God?" Mr. Brunner asked. "Titan," I corrected myself. "And he didn't trust his kids, who were the gods. So, Kronos ate them, right? But his wife hid baby Zeus and gave Kronos a rock to eat instead. And later, when Zeus grew up, he tricked his dad, Kronos, into barfing up his brothers and sisters." "Ew," said one of the girls behind me. "And so there was this big fight between the gods and the Titans," I continued. "And the gods won." Some snickers from the group. Behind me, Nancy Bobofit mumbled to a friend, "Like we're going to use this in real life. Like it's going to say on our job applications, 'Please explain why Kronos ate his kids.'" And why, Mr. Jackson? Bruner said. To paraphrase Mrs. Beaumont's excellent question, does this matter in real life? Busted, Grover muttered. Shut up, Nancy hissed, her face even brighter red than her hair. At least Nancy got packed too. Mr. Bruner was the only one who ever caught her saying anything wrong. He had radar ears. I thought about this question and shrugged. I don't know, sir. I see. Mr. Bruner looked disappointed. Well, half credit, Mr. Jackson. Zeus did indeed feed Cronus a mixture of mustard and wine, which made him disgorge his other 5 children, who, of course, being immortal gods, had been living and growing up completely undigested in Titan's stomach. The gods defeated their father, sliced him to pieces with his own scythe, and scattered his remains in Tartarus, the darkest part of the underworld. On that happy note, it's time for lunch. Mrs. Dodds, would you lead us back outside? The class drifted off, and the girls holding their stomachs, the guys pushing each other around and acting like doofuses. So pause there because I'm already seeing some examples of, or characteristics of a myth. So we heard a lot about gods and titans and some unrealistic things happening where these gods were like staying alive inside of the titan's stomach. So I want you to keep thinking about all of those things because it's going to pay to remember that later in the story. We're going to keep going. Grover and I were about to follow when Mr. Bruner and Mr. Jackson. When Mr. Bruner said, Mr. Jackson, I knew that was coming. I told Grover to keep going. Then I turned to Mr. Bruner. Sir? Mr. Bruner had this look that wouldn't let you go, intense brown eyes that could have been 1,000 years old, and had seen everything. About the Titans, about real life, and how your studies apply to it. Oh, what you learn from me, he said, is vitally important. I expect you to treat it as such. I will accept only the best from you, Percy Jackson. I wanted to get angry. This guy pushed me so hard. I mean, sure, it was kind of cool on tournament days when he dressed up in a suit of Roman armor and shouted, "What ho!" and challenged us, sword pointed against chalk, to run to the board and name every Greek and Roman person who had ever lived, and their mother, and what god they worshipped. But Mr. Bruner expected me to be as good as everyone else. Despite the fact that I have dyslexia and attention deficit disorder, and I had never made above a C- in my life. No, he didn't expect me to be as good. He expected me to be better. And I just couldn't learn all those names and facts, much less spell them correctly. Be thinking about the character traits you would use to describe him. I mumbled something about trying harder, while Mr. Bruner took one long, sad look at the steel, like he had been at this girl's funeral. He told me to go outside and eat my lunch. The class gathered in the front steps of the museum where we could watch the foot traffic along Fifth Avenue. Overhead, a huge storm was brewing, with clouds blacker than I'd ever seen over the city. I figured maybe it was global warming or something because the weather all across New York State had been weird since Christmas. We'd had massive snowstorms, flooding, wildfires, and lightning strikes. I wouldn't have been surprised if this was hurricane blowing in. Nobody else seemed to notice. Some of the guys were pelting pigeons with Lunchable crackers. Nancy Beaumont was trying to pickpocket something from a lady's purse, and of course Mrs. Dodds wasn't seeing a thing. Grover and I sat on the edge of a fountain, away from the others. We thought that maybe if we did that, everybody wouldn't know we were from that school. The school for loser freaks who couldn't make it elsewhere. Detention? Grover asked. Nah, I said. Not for Mr. Bruner. I just wish he'd lay off me sometimes. I mean, I'm not a genius. Grover didn't say anything for a while. Then, when I thought he was going to give me some deep philosophical comment to make me feel better, he said, Can I have your apple? I didn't have much of an appetite, so I let him take it. I watched the stream of cabs going down Fifth Avenue and thought about my mother's apartment, only a little ways uptown from where we sat. I hadn't seen her since Christmas. I wanted so bad to jump in the taxi and head home. She'd hug me and be glad to see me, but she'd be disappointed too. She'd send me right back to Yancey, remind me that I had to try harder, even if this was my sixth school in 6 years, and I was probably going to be kicked out again. I wouldn't be able to stand that sad look she'd give me. Mr. Bruner parked his wheelchair at the base of the handicap ramp. He ate celery while he read his paperback novel. A red umbrella stuck up from the back of his chair, making it look like a motorized cafe table. I was about to unwrap my sandwich when Nancy Bumblefoot appeared in front of me with her ugly friends. I guess she'd gotten tired of stealing from the tourists and dumped her half-eaten lunch in Grover's lap. Oops, she grinned at me with her crooked teeth. Her freckles were orange as if somebody had spray-painted her face with liquid Cheetos. I tried to stay cool. The school counselor had told me 1,000,000 times, count to 10, get control of your temper. But I was so mad my mind went blank. A wave roared in my ears. I don't remember touching her, but the next thing I knew, Nancy was sitting on her butt in the fountain screaming, "Percy pushed me!" Mrs. Dodd materialized next to us. Some of the kids were whispering, "Did you see? The water? Like, it grabbed her." I didn't know what they were talking about. All I knew was that I was in trouble again. As soon as Mrs. Dodds was sure poor little Nancy was okay, promising to get her a new shirt at the museum gift shop, etc., etc., Mrs. Dodds turned on me. There was a triumphant fire in her eyes, as if I'd done something that she'd been waiting for all semester. "Now, honey." "I know," I grumbled. "A month erasing workbooks." That wasn't the right thing to say. "Come with me," Mrs. Dodds said. "Wait," Grover yelped. "It was me. I pushed her." I stared at him, stunned. I couldn't believe he was trying to cover for me. Mrs. Dodds scared Grover to death. She glared at him so hard his whiskery chin trembled. "I don't think so, Mr. Underwood," she said, "but you will stay here." Grover looked at me desperately. "It's okay, man," I told him. "Thanks for trying." "Honey," Mrs. Dodds barked at me. "Now." Nancy Bumblefoot smirked. I gave her my deluxe I'll kill you later stare. Then I turned to Mrs. Dodds, but she wasn't there. She was standing at the museum entrance, way at the top of the steps, gesturing impatiently at me to come on. How'd she get there so fast? I have moments like that a lot, when my brain falls asleep or something, and the next thing I know I've missed something, as if a puzzle piece fell out of the universe and left me staring at the blank place behind it. The school counselor told me this was part of ADHD, but my brain misinterpreting things. I wasn't so sure. I went after Mrs. Dodds. Halfway up the steps, I glanced back at Grover. He was looking pale, cutting his eyes between me and Mr. Burner, like he wanted Mr. Burner to notice what was going on, but Mr. Burner was absorbed in his book. I looked back up. Mrs. Dodds had disappeared again. She was now inside the building, at the end of the entrance hall. Okay, I thought. She's going to make me buy a new shirt for Nancy at the gift shop. But apparently that wasn't the plan. I followed her deep into the museum. When I finally caught up to her, we were back in the Greek and Roman section. Except for us, the gallery was empty. Mrs. Dodds stood with her arms crossed in front of the big marble frieze of the Greek gods. She was making this weird noise in her throat, like growling. Even without the noise, I would have been nervous. It's weird being alone with the teacher, especially Mrs. Dodds. Something about the way she looked at the frieze as if she wanted to pulverize it. "You've been giving us problems, honey," she said. I did the safe thing. I said, "Yes, ma'am." She tugged on the cuffs of her leather jacket. "Did you really think you would get away with it?" The look in her eye was beyond mad. It was evil. "She's a teacher," I thought nervously. "It's not like she's going to hurt me." I said, I'll try harder, ma'am." Thunder shook the building. Ooh, thunder. That's another, think about those different characteristics of a myth. "We are not fools, Percy Jackson," Mrs. Dodds said. "It was only a matter of time before we found you out. Confess, and you will suffer less pain." I didn't know what she was talking about. All I could think of was that the teachers must have found the illegal stash of candy I'd been selling out of my dorm room. Or maybe they'd realized I got my essay on Tom Sawyer from the internet without ever reading the book, and now they were going to take away my grade. Or worse, they were going to make me read the book. "Well," she demanded. "Ma'am, your time is up," she hissed. Then the weirdest thing happened. Her eyes began to glow like barbecue coals. Her fingers stretched, turning into talons. Her jacket melted into large, leathery wings. She wasn't human. She was a shriveled hag with bat wings and claws and a full mouth of yellow fangs, and she was about to slice me to ribbons. Then things got even stranger. Mr. Brunner, who'd been out in front of the museum a minute before, wheeled his chair in the doorway of the gallery, holding a pen in his hand. "What ho, Percy!" he shouted, and tossed the pen through the air. Mrs. Dodds lunged at me. With a yelp, I dodged and felt the talons slash the air next to my ear. I snatched the ballpoint pen out of the air, and when it hit my hand, it wasn't a pen anymore. It was a sword, Mr. Brunner's bronze sword, which he had always used on tournament day. Mrs. Dodds spun towards me with a murderous look in her eyes. Her knees were jelly. My hand was shaking so bad I almost dropped the sword. She snarled, "Die, honey," and she flew straight at me. Absolute terror ran through my body. I did the only thing that came naturally. I swung the sword. The metal blade hit her shoulder and passed clean through her body as if she were made of water. Hiss! Mrs. Dodds was a sandcastle and a power fan. She exploded into yellow powder, vaporized on the spot, leaving nothing but the smell of sulfur and dying screech and a chill of evil in the air, as if those two glowing red eyes were still watching me. I was alone. There was a ballpoint pen in my hand. Mr. Brunner wasn't there. Nobody was there but me. My hands were still trembling. My lunch must have been contaminated with magic mushrooms or something. Had I imagined that whole thing? I went back outside. It had started to rain. Grover was sitting by the fountain, a museum map tented over his head. Nancy Bobofit was still standing there, soaked from her swim in the fountain, grumbling to her ugly friends. When she saw me, "I hope Mrs. Kerr whipped your butt." I said, "Who?" "Our teacher, duh." I blinked. We had no teacher named Mrs. Kerr. I asked Nancy what she was talking about. She just rolled her eyes and turned away. I asked Grover where Mrs. Dodds was. He said, "Who?" But he paused first, and he wouldn't look at me, so I thought he was messing with me. "Not funny, man," I told him. "This is serious." Thunder boomed overhead. I saw Mr. Brunner sitting under his umbrella, reading his book as if he had never moved. I went over to him. He looked up, a little distracted. "Ah, that would be my pen. Please bring your own writing utensil in the future, Mr. Jackson." I handed Mr. Brunner his pen. I hadn't even realized I was still holding it. "Sir," I said, "where's Mrs. Dodds?" He stared at me blankly. "Who?" "The other chaperone, Mrs. Dodds, the pre-algebra teacher." He frowned and sat forward, looking mildly concerned. "Percy, there is no Mrs. Dodds on this trip. As far as I know, there has never been a Mrs. Dodds at Yancey Academy. Are you feeling all right?" So, that is the end of chapter 1. I hope you guys are interested in the story so far. I'm excited to see what happens with Percy Jackson and what was going on in that part of the story in the next few chapters coming up. Today, for your final independent practice, you're going to continue working on, this objective to describe a character's based off their thoughts, words, and actions. So I want you to think of what word you would use to describe Percy Jackson based on the second half of that chapter and show your evidence with it. You can find it in the day 131 document. Have an awesome day, and I will see you tomorrow to read chapter 2. Bye.